Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. Boy, I tell you, I got a good scald on my coffee this morning. Whoa. um, Instead of grinding the beans fine, we did a little bit more of a coarse. Now, it takes more of the grind to get the strength that I want, but my goodness gracious, it's good. Okay. Thought I'd share that with you. And yeah, it's Javalia. No, I'm sorry. This is Kona. I like Javalia and I like Kona. All right. Now, this is video number 7. My plan is, that this will be the final video in my response and refutation of Kenneth Gentry's recent 4 articles in which he attacked my brand new book entitled Watching for the Parousia, Were Jesus' Apostles Confused? Now, you really have to understand how foundational, how critical it is that Mr. Gentry be able to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that in Matthew chapter 24, in response to Jesus' prediction of the destruction of the city and the temple, that the apostles were confused. That is, they wrongly, confusingly, ignorantly believed that the destruction of that temple had to happen at the end of the current Christian age, or, as Mr. Gentry puts it, at the end of human history. As I've noted before, Mr. Gentry is very careful not to use the terminology at the end of the Christian age, because Mr. Gentry is very much aware of the fact that the Bible teaches there is no end to the current Christian age. Well, if there is no end to the current Christian age, either the apostles did not know that, if Mr. Gentry's right, or Mr. Gentry's entire paradigm is false. So he very assiduously, very carefully avoids talking about the end of the current Christian age. Instead, he uses the terminology, the end of human history, or just simply the end of the age, conveniently omitting what age he's talking about. Well, anyway, there are 3 points that I'm going to do my best to cover in this final video. I may not get it all in, so I may possibly have to do one more video, but my purpose is to get it in there. Point number 1, Mr. Gentry, as I pointed out in the previous video, makes it a point, and in article number 3 and in article number 4 of his 4-part series, and evidently in the upcoming book that he's currently writing to try to demonstrate and to prove the apostles were confused, this will play a major role. It will be a key argument in that book. I rather doubt that Mr. Gentry is going to point his readers to these videos, or that he will point his readers to the articles that I have written in response to his 4 articles that are on my website, donkpreston.com. Yeah, I kind of doubt he's going to point them there. But be that as it may, his argument is Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple. He does not mention the destruction of the land, the people, or the city. Only the temple. Do you not see all of these stones of the temple? The time is coming in which not one stone will be left standing on top of another. The apostles asked, tell us when shall these things, the destruction of the temple, having nothing whatsoever to do with the land, the people, or the city. And so Mr. Gentry is arguing that since the words land, people, city do not appear in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 3, that the apostles were not asking about the fate of the land or the city or the people. Now, I have to tell you, this is really one of the most desperate kind of illogical arguments you will ever encounter. But this is not the first time in which Mr. Gentry appeals to what I call the missing word hermeneutic, or the different word hermeneutic. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, When Paul says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the coming of the Lord and our gathering together to him, that you be not soon shaken in mind, whether by letter or an epistle as if from us, that the day of the Lord had already come. Well, Paul says, I'm appealing to you by the parousia of our Lord. Strangely enough, Mr. Gentry says, and by the way, I document all of this in my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, the Wedding of the King of Kings. Mr. Gentry says 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 applied and was fulfilled in AD 70. Amazingly. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, where Paul talked about the revelation of Jesus Christ with his angels in flaming fire to take vengeance on those who do not obey God, the persecutors of the Thessalonians, Paul says Mr. Gentry says that's the end of the world. Now this is abundantly strange. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul uses the Greek word parousia. Mr. Gentry says that's AD 70. Well, wait a minute. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, in applying that chapter to the so-called end of human history, Mr. Gentry says it's different from chapter 2. Why? Well, because Paul uses a different word to talk about the coming of the Lord. He uses a form of the Greek word erkomai, the Greek word elthi. So according to Mr. Gentry, because a different word is used in chapter 1 from chapter 2, that demands two different comings. Oh, wait a minute. In Matthew 24, 29 to 31, Jesus spoke of his coming, the coming of the Son of Man, and he uses erkomai, from which elthe comes. And guess what? Mr. Gentry says, Matthew 24, 29 to 31, AD 70. Oh, but wait. Elthi, from erkomai, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, has to be the end of the world. Oh, but we're not done. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul uses parousia. That's AD 70, says Mr. Gentry. Oh, wait a minute. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 13 to 18, Paul uses the Greek word parousia. Uh-oh. You see a train coming, maybe? Yeah. And he says, that's the end of human history. So on the one hand, the use of different words in 2 Thessalonians demands two different comings. On the other hand, the use of the same word in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, which is AD 70, and yet Paul uses the same word in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and that's the end of the world. Now, folks, you will seldom find a more self-contradictory, a more illogical, and yes, a more desperate hermeneutic and application. His concept is when you have words missing in Matthew 24 verse 3, oh, those things are not in the context. Those things are not in the discussion. But wait a minute. When I could go on and on. Pardon me. There's so many examples in Mr. Gentry's writings in which he arbitrarily and capriciously says, well, this text, parousia, that's the end of human history. Well, wait a minute. Parousia is used in this text. Oh, that's AD 70. This text uses erkomai. Oh, yeah, that's AD 70. Oh, but wait a minute. Erkomai over here, that's the end of the world. Absolutely arbitrary. Totally capricious. Now, this becomes more than evident when we see how Mr. Gentry's hermeneutic of different words, missing words, is used and applied, if we applied his hermeneutic consistently. Let me give you for instance. Mr. Gentry takes Acts chapter 1 and the coming of the Lord, quote, in like manner, as referring to the end of the current Christian age. But wait a minute. The text of Acts chapter 1 does not mention Christ coming at the end of the age. It does not mention coming in flaming fire. It does not mention the coming of the Lord with a shout. It does not mention the gathering of the saints, and it does not mention the destruction of heaven and earth. Every one of those words and terms is missing from Acts chapter 1. Does that bother Mr. Gentry? No. Even though all of those words and terms are missing from Acts chapter 1, he says Acts 1 is the end of the world. Well, guess what? He goes to 2 Peter chapter 3, and he says 2 Peter 3 is about the end of the world. Well, wait a minute. 2 Peter chapter 3 does not mention, not one word about, let's see, end of the age. It has last days, but not end of the age. And it says not one word about the coming of the Lord with his angels on the clouds with a shout. Not one word. Not one word about the gathering of the elect. It has new heaven and new earth and the destruction of heaven and earth. Now, Mr. Gentry would argue, well, you see, because it's talking about the destruction of heaven and earth and the new heaven and new earth, and since that's at the final coming, then that must be included in Acts chapter 1. Okay, great, amen. But it disproves his hermeneutic in 2 Thessalonians 1 and 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And it falsifies his hermeneutic on Matthew 24, verse 3. Because I've shared with you from his own writings, where Mr. Gentry even poses the question, can it be argued that in Matthew 24, Jesus was predicting the destruction of only the temple, and Mr. Gentry says, no, that's an untenable argument. So on the one hand, Mr. Gentry recognizes that his own hermeneutic is false, but then he turns around and emphasizes it in his arguments against my book. Now, mind you, when he argued that you can't say temple only in Matthew 24:3, he wasn't arguing against the preterist paradigm. He was arguing against dispensationalists. So Mr. Gentry has one set of arguments when he's debating dispensationalists. He has a totally different argument when he's trying to debate true preterism. Okay, so that illustrates in very, very brief form the fallacy of Mr. Gentry's hermeneutic. The second point I want to make is that Mr. Gentry, as foundational to his divided Olivet Discourse doctrine, is Matthew 24 and verse 36. But of that day and hour knows no man, no, not the angels, and as Mark 13:31 interjects, but the Father only. So, Mr. Gentry, now watch this, based upon his presuppositional, unproven presupposition, to be repetitious here, that the apostles asked about two things, that Jesus was talking about two different things, Mr. Gentry approaches this text, Matthew 24:36, and says, okay, Matthew 24, 4 to 35, Jesus was talking about the destruction of the temple in AD 70. But in Matthew 24:36, Jesus uses the Greek word day, an adversative. It's not always an adversative, by the way. It's very often a connective to emphasize. Nonetheless, he says it's an adversative demanding that he is contrasting what he is about to say with what he has already said. In other words, he's been talking about those days. Now he wants to talk about that day. Well, the question needs to be asked, is it not distinctly possible that Jesus' those days of the Great Tribulation would lead up to that day of his coming in AD 70? Well, guess what? That's precisely what we have in Matthew 24, 29 to 34. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, guess what? They will see the Son of Man coming. Well, isn't that the day of the Lord? Therefore, it's those days consummating in that day. But again, Mr. Gentry says this is an adversative. This is a contrast between those days versus that day. And again, he presupposes that that day is the end of the age. Well, again, we have to ask the question, the end of what age? Well, contextually, the only end of the age is the end of the age that the apostles linked with the destruction of the temple. Do not forget this, ladies and gentlemen. Kenneth Gentry admits, and it's in his writings, I gave you the quote in an earlier video, in which he says, the end of the age fully arrived in AD 70. So he has the apostles asking a question about the end of the age, which they linked with the fall of Jerusalem. On the one hand, Gentry says, oh, they were talking about the end of time, the end of the Christian age, but then he turns around and tells us, well, you know what, after all, the end of the age that was connected to the destruction of the temple, historically and contextually, actually did come in AD 70. So he interjects two ends of two different ages into the same identical text. Now, you have to understand that lying underneath Mr. Gentry's argument is a complete and total ignorance of the significance and the importance of Israel's feast days to Jesus' language. So far, I have adduced and found no less than 5 different direct allusions, citations really, of the language of Israel's festal calendar. Matthew chapter 23, you will see me no more until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. A direct citation from Psalms 118 that was sung as the people in Jerusalem saw the pilgrims coming to celebrate the feast days. So Jesus, in a very cryptic way nonetheless, was saying, you're going to see me coming in the judgment of Matthew 23:37. When? When you say and when you sing, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And now in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 36, Jesus is saying, but of that day and hour knows no man. What day and hour? The day of the judgment. The day of his coming. The coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now, what is absolutely amazing, what you have to understand, is that the terminology of no man knows the day and the hour is taken directly from the 5th of Israel's feast days, the first of the last 3 feast days, which were Israel's eschatological feast days, and it was called Rosh Hashanah, or Rosh Hashanah. It was the time of the judgment. Now, the reason they called it Rosh Hashanah, it was also called the Feast of the New Moons, and it could only begin at the announcement of the appearance of the new moon. Well, you know, if it was cloudy, if it was foggy, if the weather was bad, they couldn't see the new moon. I mean, you know, after all, it's just barely a little bit of a sliver. And as a result of the uncertainty of being able to see the new moon at the proper time, the high priest would send witnesses out to 2, perhaps 3 mountains in different locations with the responsibility to watch for the new moon, in the hope that, well, if there's clouds obstructing the view over here, they can see it over here. And when that new moon was spotted, the witnesses would come back, 2 or 3 witnesses, would come back and announce the appearance of the new moon. But because of the uncertainty of being able to witness the new moon, that feast day, the day of judgment, was called the feast concerning which no man knows the day or the hour. Now, Jesus told his apostles that by witnessing the signs, they could know when it would be near, even at the door. And he told them they could know it was in that generation, but he told them they could not know the day or the hour. You see, it is only by ignoring, or perhaps denying, the centrality of Jesus' language of the fulfillment of Israel's feast days that Mr. Gentry is able to rip it out of that festal context and say, oh, well, you see, Jesus is contrasting his earlier prediction of the judgment of Jerusalem at the time of the feast days, and make it apply to the end of the current Christian age, which has nothing whatsoever to do with the fulfillment of Israel's feast days in Mr. Gentry's paradigm. Well, that's all the time I can spend on point number 2. Point number 3 is found in his article number 4, and that is that in what he calls his forthcoming commentary on Matthew 21 to 25, he says, I will be explaining Jesus' resolution to the disciples' confusion. Now, again, he takes for granted the apostles' confusion. And he says, that is, Jesus will affirm the theological linkage, watch this, the theological linkage of AD 70 and the final judgment. He will declare the historical distinction of these two events. One occurs at the beginning of Christian history, the other at the end of human history. Well, there he goes again, end of human history, instead of the end of the Christian age. Now, here's what you have to understand. This is found throughout the entirety of Mr. Gentry's writings, over and over and over again. He affirms that AD 70 was of tremendous theological and redemptive significance as a foreshadowing and as a type of the end of the current age. And so Mr. Gentry must be able to convince you and his readers that AD 70 was a mere type and a shadow of the real end of the age. Now remember, he admits AD 70 was the end of the age that fully arrived at that time. But the real end of the age, he says, was typified and foreshadowed. You know, he's not the only one that makes that argument. Amillennialist Kim Riddlebarger makes that argument. Keith Matheson has made that argument. I don't know if he still does. He seems to change from week to week. But anyway, some years ago, I wrote a book in response to that. It was 2013, so almost 8 years ago now. I wrote a book entitled AD 70, A Shadow of the Real End. In this book, I adduced 10, perhaps 11 points that completely and totally refute Mr. Gentry's claim that AD 70 was a type or a shadow, a foreshadowing of the real end. Now, some of the things that I point out in this book is, Paul said, 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and 11, the end of the ages has come upon us. Well, the word end there is from the Greek word telos, which means goal, and thus Paul was saying that the goal of all the previous ages was coming on them. Now, if Mr. Gentry is right, what Paul should have said, and by the way, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul said that the Old Testament events, the Old Testament people, they were types of us, Paul said. That's the literal rendering of the Greek of the text. Paul never says, boy, you got to catch the power of this. Paul and no New Testament writer ever says, we are types of what will happen. Or they never point to AD 70 and say the end of that age or this age points to the end of the age of Christ. Not one time. But you see, if Mr. Gentry is correct, Paul was wrong. Because Paul said the goal of all the previous ages had arrived and was arriving in the first century. But if Mr. Gentry is correct, then the true goal, i.e., the new heaven and new earth, the true goal of all of the previous ages, did not arrive in the first century. Oh, but wait a minute, you see, Mr. Gentry admits that the new creation of Christ arrived in the first century. 2 Corinthians 5:17. So here we go again. Mr. Gentry understands new creation arrived with Christ. Oh, but wait a minute. The real one, the one foreshadowed by the events of the first century, that doesn't come, well, let's see, that doesn't come until the end of the current Christian new heaven and new earth. Bottom line is, nowhere in the Old Testament or the New are we ever told, nowhere is it hinted, nowhere is it inferred, nowhere is it suggested that the current Christian age, or to rephrase, nowhere is it affirmed that AD 70 and what happened there was a foreshadowing of anything beyond that. It just is not there. And thus, a key pillar, a key element of Mr. Gentry's theology finds no support whatsoever in the Bible. Now look, for the rest of this month, boy, time's almost up, you know. For the rest of this month, and if you want to take advantage of this, you got to contact me, okay? I have a fantastic 3-book special. AD 70, A Shadow of the Real End, ? Elijah Has Come, a solution to Romans 11, 25 to 27. By the way, Mr. Gentry takes Romans 11, 25 to 27 as the sine qua non. I mean, the ultimate passage of postmillennialism pointing to the future. But he's just simply wrong. And can you believe Jesus said this? Now, if you ordered these books separately and paid postage, they would cost you almost $60. But on this special, and again, time's almost up. You got to hurry. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Beautiful banner right up at the top. Click on it. Order these 3 books. January 2021, U.S. orders only. $30 post-paid to you. And listen, if you live overseas and you want PDFs of these books, contact me through my website and I'll be able to help you at even a greater savings. But listen, folks, you just got to see Mr. Gentry's 4 articles in which he attacked me, I would say viciously, I would say caustically, these articles have been completely and totally debunked. Mr. Gentry's attack has been blunted and falsified. His theology has been falsified. Well, thank you for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. You have a fantastic weekend. God bless. See you on Monday.